I spent the time polishing my boots and blancoing my webbing and polishing the brass buttons on my tunic. Others played cards, read books, and generally dodged. I took to army life better than most. There had been discipline in the Boy Scouts, and I had reached the level of patrol leader before becoming a Rover Scout, so I was used to it. Plus, I had had to be disciplined for my job. But others really struggled with it. If anyone stepped out of line, the army had some inventive punishments lined up for them. They might be given 7 days of Janker's punishment duties, such as performing in full kit with their rifle presented in front of them or peeling endless mountains of spuds. The most soul-destroying punishment of all was the mind-bending task of painting coal white. Eventually we received rifles for .22 shooting practice. Once adept with the small-bore rifles, we progressed to .303 training in the nearby sand dunes. I had never fired a gun before and was surprised by the powerful kick that the .303 gave you. But I became a reasonable shot. As well as the bayonet practice and obstacle courses, we trained in hand-to-hand combat. I was coping well, especially at the fitness tasks. There was a level of competition between the men, which the NCOs would try to play up as much as they could. It was more good banter 28 than anything else, but it was a healthy way to train. The NCOs were also quite obviously picking out people for the overseas draft. Of the original 28 of us, 8 failed to make the grade. I was one of the unlucky 20 selected to go to war. After being selected for the draft, I was immediately given 7 days home leave. I had to wear my uniform in public, but it was great to get back home. My own bed had never felt so warm and cosy. While I enjoyed Mum's home cooking and being around loved ones again, I could never fully relax because I knew I would soon be leaving again. I was really leaving home this time. We knew we were being sent somewhere, but we never had any inkling as to where it might be. The short stay at home gave me time to reflect on the past 6 weeks and on what lay ahead. The Gordon Highlanders had a proud military history dating back to 1794, when the regiment was raised by the 4th Duke of Gordon. Many of the original recruits were drawn from the huge Gordon estates to fight Napoleon's armies during the French Revolutionary Wars. The first recruitment campaign was assisted by the Duchess of Gordon, who was said to have offered a kiss as an incentive to join her husband's regiment. Winston Churchill described the Gordons, who helped expand the British Empire with service on the frontiers of India, Afghanistan, Egypt, Sudan, and South Africa, as the finest regiment that ever was. The Gordons were famous in and around Aberdeen and were always at the forefront of battle, a fact highlighted by their terrible losses in the First World 29 War. I would strut around town ramrod straight and proud to wear the uniform of my local regiment. Both terrified and excited at the prospect of seeing some action, I did my best to keep my emotions in check. A small clue to our ultimate destination came soon after I returned to the barracks. I was sent straight to the quartermaster's storeroom and issued with tropical fatigues and a topee. I personally had no idea where we were headed. As far as I was concerned, it could have been anywhere around the Mediterranean or the African desert. We were due to leave immediately, but as luck would have it, Aberdeen was hit by one of the worst snowstorms in its history. Snow piled up and trains halted. Everyone was well and truly snowed in. The pace of recruitment had picked up and, with the barracks filling up, my shortened platoon of 20 marched to Linksfield School Hall a few miles away to wait instructions. It was to become our home for a full 3 weeks as we waited out the snow. To prevent us going completely stir-crazy, the bosses allowed us out between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. We could not go home, even for a visit, but the fresh air did us good. I went to local dances whenever I could, even though I had to dance in my uniform. We had no one in charge of us for most of the day, until a sergeant or corporal would arrive at 7 in the evening to check us in and out. I made friends with most of the men in the unit, and we all got on pretty well, which helped. Thankfully, there was no bullying of weaker members or cliques scheming in corners. 30? 1 or 2 men looked to me for some leadership since I was prepared to take charge of situations, but I never really bonded too close to any of the men. I was civil with them all, and I got on with my own affairs. Like so much of army service, it was a boring time. At the end of November, the snow finally lifted. We marched the 4 or 5 miles into town, down Main Street, to the railway station. On the train there were no seats for us, and we had to sit in the corridors on top of our kit bags. It was freezing cold, and as the train rattled south it followed the familiar route that I had sometimes taken to cycle to Dundee, to see my father's parents, retired textile workers in the Empire's great Jutiopolis, where hundreds of smokestacks from the jute mills belched out a thick pall of smoke across the city, sarcastically described in postcards of the day as Bonnie Dundee. We passed through the fishing town of Stonehaven with its picturesque harbour. Nearby, spectacular Dunnottar Castle towered above sheer cliffs, jutting out defiantly into the grey waters of the North Sea. Here, Braveheart William Wallace had burned the English garrison alive in the castle chapel, and later 167 radical Protestants had been squeezed into a small dungeon and left to die in Scotland's own black hole of Calcutta. I shuddered to think of it, and was glad that we had moved on from the cruelty of the Middle Ages, or so I thought. Next we passed through Arbroath. The lofty ruins of the red sandstone abbey dominated the skyline, rising above the cottages of the fisherfolk in the area known as the Fit Zero, the Toon, where each house seemed to boast a haddock-smoking shed in the backyard, producing the famous Arbroath smokies. For a lot of people, Arbroath was the spiritual heart of Scotland. In 1320, the Scots had boldly announced their determination to resist English domination. The words of the famous Declaration of Arbroath echo across the ages. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. Now it was us that were to be fighting for freedom, and a more reluctant band of freedom fighters would be hard to imagine. William Wallace and his men may have been warriors. We were most definitely not. A collection of timid, ill-trained clerks and farm boys, we were to be pitched into a conflict that would plumb the depths of medieval barbarism, against a ruthless and blood-drenched foe with a decade of fighting experience. As we shugled across the Tay-rail bridge, the piers of the old bridge poked out of the waters below, serving as an eerie memorial to all those who had drowned in the famous disaster of 60 years before. I was quite literally entering an unknown world. My thoughts turned to home and a happy childhood. Mum, Dad and Auntie Dossie would be hugging the kitchen fire now, and I smiled as I thought of Dad and Auntie Dossie bickering over who should poke the coal fire, the only source of heat in the house. Dossie was Mum's sister. Her real name was Kathleen, but she was known as Dossie. Mum and Dossie were as thick as thieves, always laughing and joking. They would constantly be ganging up on Father. I don't know how he managed to put up with the two of them. My father was a very serious, regimented man. He lived his life wrapped in the security of a grey suit and a rigid routine. Every night when he returned home from work at the college, Mother would have the tea ready to put on the table. Father sat at the head of the table and was always served first. Talk was strictly discouraged, as was reading. To us, he was the strictest father in the world. After dinner, he would sit in front of the fire. Ignoring the incessant chatter between Mum and Dossie, he would read a library book for half an hour, then put it down and pick up his card tray and play Patience for half an hour. Then he would read for half an hour, play Patience, and so it went on until it was time for bed. It would be the same story every night except on Saturdays, when at 9 in the evening he would catch a tram car to Castle Gate. He would pop into the same pub to stand at the bar and drink a half-pint of beer. Then he would go to the market, where he could buy unsold produce cheaply, and come back with some discounted fruit or meat. He did that every week, year in, year out. He was a real creature of habit. Dad stayed an aloof figure in the household. Born in the reign of Queen Victoria, he was a product of his generation, and Victorian in many ways. He maintained a stiff upper lip, and whenever he went for a walk in the evenings, he selected his favourite walking stick. Mum never went with him, but his plain willow stick always did. He walked to work, but he never used the stick in a busyness situation, only for pleasure. I can recall seeing a photograph of Father with around a dozen of his friends, and they are all clutching walking sticks. I still have his stick, and it is one of my great treasures. My fondest memories of Dad are from the time in 1935, when we moved from rented accommodation into our bungalow in Aberdeen. He decided to convert the attic into 2 bedrooms and selected me as his labourer and assistant. It was a great time, and I was as proud as Punch. He was a marvel to watch, a real craftsman with his hands. He was about 5 foot 6 inches, slim, with light golden